So you have Electrum Performance then, and is that out of your own facility or you out of a jiu-jitsu gym there?
No, it's out of my own facility. So,
Okay.
we've got our own space. We do have mats there. When I set it up, yeah, there was just no way in hell that I wasn't gonna put mats down. Now, it's not huge. It's enough for, like, a group of 2 to go from the feet. You could have 4 people training
Yeah.
at the same time, but then it's a bit more restricted. But the way I see it, especially working with a ton of fighters, it was a matter of either you put mats down or halfway through a workout, someone's showing somebody else a new position on, and the floor becomes the mats anyways, you know?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Give me some of your background though, because I don't know much about your background other than your crusade against fascia bros, which is which I think you're leading the charge on social media. But give us some of your background.
Thanks. I mean, I guess that's the most important part. It's really all downhill from there. All right. Background. So, uh, I went to UConn
Oh yeah,
because of
that's why you're
the
always repping.
yeah. Yeah, because of the tournament, I decided to be a little festive today, got that big game tomorrow, but, yeah, went to the University of Connecticut, got my degree in strength and conditioning in the kinesiology department there, worked with 8 of the varsity Division I teams in the weight room under 2 different strength coaches. Those were the formative years, you know? It was a great kinesiology program at the time, we were under Dr. Kramer,
Oh,
and
nice.
yeah, it was, those interning hours in particular, we only had to do 200, I believe, and I did something closer to 1,500. You know, essentially, as long as those coaches would have me, I was there. And yeah, from there, I, I grew up in Connecticut, so I stayed home, worked in commercial fitness for a year, but you know, I knew I wanted to be in Southern California. I'd been training jujitsu myself since 2004. Um, Long story short, a friend of mine who after college moved out to San Diego and was training at Atos. In 2015, I went out to compete in Pans when they were held in Irvine. Stayed with my buddy in San Diego there, and I was like, man, this is where I got to be. So went home, quit my job, tied up my loose ends, and a month later, little over a month later, was driving out here with everything I owned in my Jeep, and I've been out here ever since.
Dude, nice. And then you opened your own facility. That's kind of you transitioned from that kind of internship straight into your own facility, private area.
Okay, yeah, so did that year in commercial fitness back home, realized that I hated the commercial fitness,
Dude,
one-on-one
we've
model.
all been there. We've all been there.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about the limitations there, but I think essentially it's, a terrible use of, uh, the coach's time. It's a terrible use of the client's resources. It's just, not all that sustainable. And so, yeah, moved out here, was working at like a sport performance facility. My thought was like, hey, within, maybe within 5 or 10 years, I could be working with some of those top guys. Actually, to bring it back to when I was in that kinesiology program, I remember in one of our sports admin classes, on one of the first days, they had us like introduce ourselves, talk about what we wanted to do within strength and conditioning or kinesiology, like career wise. You got the people that are there, before physical therapy. They're sort of talking about their path. We had some guys that there was one guy that wanted to work as a strength coach in NASCAR. You had someone else that wanted to be in baseball. People wanted to do stuff in the private sector. Division I environments, professional sports, the whole gambit. And when it got to me, I was like, I want to work with combat sport athletes, either MMA or jujitsu. And there was no UFC Performance Institute at the time. There was nothing. We're talking, this was 2013, 2012.
Yeah.
Uh, and, uh, and so they're like, okay, so where do you go for that? And I'm like, well, you go somewhere where there's a lot of fighters. I'm like, I kind of envision myself doing something in the private sector and getting into it. And because I trained jujitsu for a while, even at that point in time, I was like, you know, finding somewhere to ingrain myself into that culture and try to build a business around it. And it's funny because it was one of the less well defined and more sounded kind of like a dreamer in the sense that it wasn't anything that had like a clear path, and it was kind of like, okay, kid, like you'll figure it out. And you know, uh, to their credit, it was kind of a dreamer thing. I just, went out there, made a series of decisions that wound up being pretty fruitful. I thought it would take years to start to work with some of the top guys. Within a couple months of being out here, JT Torres, who was a top black belt at Atos at the time, was just coming back from meniscus surgery. He reached out to me. We sat down, man, and it just exploded from there. JT is a natural leader. He's got a great attitude, mindset, approach to everything. One of the first things he did with me, this was prompted by him once we got started. He wanted to map out his ideal training week. So he had all
Mm,
of his, high effort training days with comp class, some of his lower effort, like skill building sessions built in there. And he wanted to be collaborative in terms of fitting in strength and conditioning when it was most appropriate. I mean, incredible stuff. And that was, again, even though I push a lot of my athletes to do that, especially nowadays, at that point in time, it was all, that's how he wanted to structure it. It was a beautiful thing. And I worked with JT for, like a year and a half until he went off and opened his own jiu-jitsu academy on the East Coast. And yeah, from there, it very quickly snowballed. He talked me up to the other guys in competition class, started working with a ton of the top guys at Atos, was training them in 2017, 2018, as an entire team, sort of mimicking that Division One
awesome.
environment, having them come in all at the same time. We rented out a gym before I had my own space. Um, and it was incredible. The energy, the vibes were unmatched. It's another chance for everybody to team build a bit. And it was, everyone was on the same page as opposed to everyone like you see in a lot of combat sports, everyone doing something a little different here, a little different
Yeah.
there. I mean, they're all hitting the same comp class. They're all, they're all trashed at the same time. They're all a bit more energized at the same time. It was, yeah, it was great. And from there in 2020, opened up my own spot here. Been here ever since. Um, yeah, and now work not just with a single competition team. I mean, I've worked with top MMA athletes, a lot of top jujitsu athletes in multiple affiliations, and yeah, really carved out that niche within combat sports.
If you're anything like me, you're short on time. Kids, family, work, training, and having to cook meals on top of that is just not going to happen. So I'm happy to announce Trifecta Nutrition are sponsoring the podcast. You get epic meals like these ones: turkey taco bowl, Texas barbecue protein plate. These are a couple of my favorites. But it means you don't have to prepare all your own meals, and it makes getting and good nutrition relatively easy. I've tried other meal delivery companies. Most of them are too high fat, not enough carbohydrates, or if you're getting kits where you have to cook it yourself, the portions for two is actually for one, especially if you are like me and you're training often. So if you want to take something off your plate and have meals like this delivered to your door, go down the description. There's a link there where you can order Trifecta meals. This is the performance line, which are higher protein and higher carbohydrate. And you can use code LIFTBIG40. You'll get 40% off your first order. Love it. That's awesome. And we'll go straight into the nitty gritty because you mentioned it now. And we're just going to, this podcast will be all over the place because that's how my brain works. So you mentioned JT Torres and kind of how he wanted to map out his week. It'd be kind of interesting maybe for listeners. I don't know if you still remember how that was structured, or maybe just generally how that kind of puzzle fit together. So if someone's listening, they could be like, oh, maybe I could start to implement some of these principles into their own jiu-jitsu training.
Yeah, so essentially, the thing that I was really pushing to him at the time was that if we're building these general qualities in the weight room, we want to be able to hit these sessions um, throughout the points of the week with the least amount of accumulated fatigue. Obviously, with people doing combat sports, particularly those that are competitive, it's kind of a fantasy land to have no fatigue whatsoever, right? But purposefully at the times where there was lower fatigue, and then the thing that I relayed to him, that I would say I'm far better at now. I mean, that was over 10 years ago now. But I was like, look, we'll make an effort that you come to me when you're at those lower points on average for fatigue. And it's up to me to make sure that I can give you the best benefit that I can without driving that fatigue up a ton. And like I said, I've gotten way better at that, especially just through the sheer volume of people that I've worked with in the last 11 plus years. Um, but yeah, that was the goal. And I think that regardless of your experience level, whether this is somebody listening to it who is just, a combat athlete themselves and not really a strength coach or super experienced in the weight room, if you go into it with some of these objectives in mind, you can go so far, right? Like at the time, a lot of, if I was sitting across from myself from 11 years ago, there's so much I could teach myself, but our objectives were sound. And I think when you have those clear objectives in mind, you've got some KPIs that you can pay attention to. You're aware of your rate limiters at what you can do at any one point in time. Again, like, will that be good enough? Absolutely. And I think it's a matter of getting it to that point of good enough and not hyperfixating on a ton of these small details, especially with combat sport athletes, right? Even, let's say you and I were training partners for jujitsu or MMA or whatever. It's actually very common if any two rounds that you and I have are not all that the same. Of course, if we've got a massive difference in skill or size or something like that, then maybe they're always the same. One of us always steamrolls the other. But for the people who tend to be your quality training partners, where there isn't a massive discrepancy, like one day, maybe I, pass your guard or something, and I'm really not working all that hard from that point forward in the round, right? You're kind of just surviving, avoiding the finish. I'm transitioning, across dominant positions. Other times, shit, maybe it's a war on the feet. There's a couple scrambles to start the round out. So we've already got our heart rates through the roof. What I'm getting at is the fact that if you try to micromanage every single detail, it can just get thrown out in an instant. You go into a class, even let's say it's a lower volume day for comp class. So it's going to be high intent for those rounds, but you get matched up on one of those days where you're both feeling good. The round starts with a couple scrambles. It doesn't really get to that static of a position. What should have been like a lower stress day is actually crazy fatiguing. So with that, there's obviously got to be some flexibility built in. And where I think that comes from is anchoring yourself with those sound principles or objectives, where as long as you're keeping those things in mind, there's actually plenty of wiggle room that is acceptable. And I think it's the combination of having those really sound things to keep you anchored, but also the flexibility to roll with the fact that it's not going to be super, super predictable. You've got somebody who is, let's say, a bodybuilder, or if you're a strength coach working with a powerlifter or a strongman, how these guys are going to feel day to day, like what you're doing as a strength coach is their primary stressor, right? So you're pretty damn aware of how they're going to feel at any one point in time because you're witnessing everything. And if you, let's say you have multiple people on the same program, they're all going to experience things pretty similarly. Obviously, there's some variation, but by and large, it's much more predictable. When you are a strength coach for any other sport, but particularly within combat sports, it can just be so different day to day. So yeah, having that flexibility, but also being anchored very strongly by those objectives or principles or whatever you want to call them that you're operating between, I think is a very good way to go about it.
What would be some examples of those objectives or principles?
Okay, cool. So we could start with the ones that I mentioned before, right? Wanting to make sure that you are coming in, if you're going to be training those general qualities, which we can break it down to 4, and we can break those down into lots of other subgroups for sure, right? And I'm sure you and I could nerd out about that, but for someone whose understanding is more surface level, we got 4 primary general qualities that we are looking to develop in the weight room. So the first one is force production or strength. The second one is rate of force production or power. The third one is going to be factors of endurance, whether that's energy system work or, local muscular endurance. Endurance is the third one. And then the fourth is going to be range of motion or flexibility. And obviously, you can shuffle those priorities based on the individual or based on the sport, the task that you're training for. But those are by and large the four general qualities that you'll be looking to build in the weight room. In general, if you are working on improving those four qualities in the weight room, you're going to expose that individual to a more potent stimulus or demand of whichever quality or multiple qualities you're focusing on at that point in time, a more potent stimulus than they would ever experience within their sport. You want to exceed the demands of the sport so you can actually build that quality. Because of that, you want to make sure that fatigue is relatively low. If fatigue is too high, the likelihood that you can even reach the demands of the sport, let alone exceed it, let alone to do so safely, is just far less likely. So relatively low fatigue, given your average across the week when you're hitting your sessions in the weight room. So that's one. Another one would be limiting fatigue while you're going through those strength and conditioning sessions. So whether that is limiting total volume, whether that is modulating intensity when you have to, there's lots of those acute program variables that you can modify such that you're getting to a productive stimulus, but you're not just driving someone so far into the ground. And that was kind of the discussion with JT, where it was like, look, I want you to come to me when you're at a lower level of fatigue, but that's going to require a bit of trust that I'm not going to drive you into the ground and make you complete shit for your next sports session, right? So yeah, one, training in the weight room at relatively low levels of fatigue. Another anchor would be limiting fatigue from those sessions while also tracking objective metrics and making sure that you're moving them in the right direction. Another one that I would say for combat sport athletes that is a tough sell sometimes. I'm sure that you have experienced this to some degree. But a major issue that I encountered a lot earlier on in my career, this is now something that I spearhead right off the bat. But I started to just notice that this was a problem. You got people coming to you with limited resources, so it might be tough for them to pay you to work with you year round. So when do they show up? They show up 8 weeks out of their most important tournament of the year. And it's like, okay,
I usually get messages that they're 3 or 4 weeks out.
I mean, it can get even worse than that, right? But let's just even take the typical 8-week camp model. And then they're like, all right, I'm going to hammer my strength and conditioning in my 8-week camp. Well, if we look across the entire year, that is probably the greatest amount of fatigue that you accumulate within your sport in an 8-week span. And now we're just adding in like a bunch of novel stimuli in the weight room. Like that is just a recipe for disaster. So the thing that I talk about with my guys, another one of these principles or anchors that I have is when you do not have a huge fight or a very significant tournament lined up, that's my in season with you. That's when we're actually going to push those general qualities a little bit further, a little bit harder, because we can to achieve, in a general sense, to achieve a little bit greater of a stimulus, we're going to accumulate a little more fatigue. So for us to really push those qualities anywhere, I want to make sure that we don't have you grinding out super tough sessions, potentially like, some of these guys are hitting hard sessions multiple times a day through camp. That is just not the time that we're looking to add weight to your squat variation or to, my hands are kind of tied at that point, especially if we haven't laid a foundation. So yeah, another one of those guiding principles is the fact that I love working with these guys through camp. I think that's great. But in an ideal world, I'm working with these guys year round, and our in season in the weight room is when they don't immediately have something on the horizon. That's when we're going to really identify, what things we're going to dial in and work on and push those numbers up. And then when we get in camp and they've just got greater stressors to recover from their sport, I dial things back. And there's going to be certain things that fall into maintenance, right? When I've got a guy that's 8 weeks leading up to ADCC Worlds, I'm not looking to add weight to that dude's squat, especially if I work with him year round. Quite frankly, as he's dropping weight and training more, if I can maintain the squat that he set in his off season with lower volumes and everything else as his body weight is going, like that is a huge win. And this can be something tough for a fighter that's listening to this, recognizing, I get it, motivation's high. You've paid your registration fee, or if you're in MMA, you've had somebody reach out to you or your manager, set the date for the fight. Okay, motivation's high. You've got your light at the end of the tunnel. You're trying to really work hard. That's when you're maybe most motivated to work in the weight room. But I actually try to curtail that a bit. And I want to have our higher efforts in the weight room when we don't have that lined up, so we can maintain some of those variables. And we have more to play with when you are in camp, so that I'm not just adding even more fatigue onto this like roaring bonfire of fatigue that we get when somebody has that stressor and they're just like pounding themselves into the ground. So that can be a tough ask. If you are a younger coach, or if you are, a combat sport athlete, and that's how you approach things. Like, I also understand that these guys sometimes get burnt out from their camps. So the last thing that they want to do is hit strength and conditioning in the month or two after one of their competitions. So I also work with them where I'm like, look, I get if we're a bit burnt out. Maybe we don't do as many days per week, but we've got, relatively high volumes for the days per week we do get in here. I'm willing to work with these guys. But I really try to shift that mindset of like, we're going to try to pull every lever in fight camp and then totally just like go off the rails after that. So that can be a bit of a hard fix, but I also think, having my own place, establishing my own culture, that's kind of the expectation now. And
Mm.
it's very valuable when you've got other people that have worked with you for years. They're sort of setting the bar for that. And the newer or younger guys coming in can look up to that and just be like, oh, damn, this is how they model it. I'm just going to sort of get in step with them. So yeah, I'd say those are some of those bigger overarching principles or anchors for what we want to do. Now, the amount of acceptable answers for how you structure that is nearly infinite, right? We don't have to focus too much on what's optimal or micromanage every detail. If you are anchored by those principles, if you're following that as a general like North Star, you're doing a lot of things right. And sure, as coaches, we might want to argue about like the perfect intervals to target this energy system and exactly how much. All that stuff falls by the wayside and is far less important than really hitting those big rocks.
Yeah, the consistency aspect is literally the most important part. And as you mentioned, if people just coming in for the 8-week camp, you're screwing yourself already on top of that. But I have a question in the live chat for you. Mr. Paul Green, I don't know if you know Paul Green, he was on the pod, a fellow jiu-jitsu practitioner. He said you covered it, but I'm going to ask you anyway before I give you some follow-ups. But he's asking the thoughts on the 80-20 endurance principles for coaches. So I'm assuming like 80% low intensity, 20% high intensity. For guys who are doing 15 to 20 hours per week on the mats.
Yeah. So this is tough, right? I like to take a lot of this stuff based on an individual basis. I don't think that's a bad guideline. I think there's plenty of wiggle room within that. I think there's some people, whether it's their, an influence of genetics where they're gonna already have solid output for certain variables anyways, versus others that despite a hefty amount of mat time have pretty piss poor VO2 max, or whatever metric we want to look at for a specific energy system. So I think you can certainly do worse, right? I think that's a solid guideline. But there's, an obvious thing in the realm of even time constraints, right? I think, obviously there's a ton of talk about zone 2. For my individuals who are full-time jiu-jitsu or combat sport athletes, and time is not really a factor, I think some zone 2 work is a great way to get some of those aerobic adaptations while minimizing fatigue. But you got to dump a lot of time into it, I think for somebody who is more like, whether they're a master's athlete or, they're competing to challenge themselves and have something to shoot for, but they've got a 9 to 5, that can be really, really tough to adhere to. And as opposed to writing it off entirely because you can't hit those crazy constraints, like something I got into it with somebody on one of my platforms recently where they were talking about, they're like, oh man, uh, anything less than 3 days a week of conditioning is just maintenance. And I'm like, really? You take someone who's doing no conditioning and you give them two relatively intense 10-ish minute interval sessions. Um, that's an additional stimulus for that person that given the right intensities will actually move them in the right direction. Now, is it going to be super noticeable, super quick? Right. We could talk about all of these other details for it. But like, yeah, not losing sight of the fact that you don't have to dump hours into conditioning work to move the needle in the right direction, especially if you're not doing a ton of that work off of the mats already. So I also like to keep that practical sense in there. It's kind of like when we're talking about like, ideal sets for hypertrophy or whatever, like bro, if you get for a target muscle group, you get even 3 or 4 across the week, you get 3 or 4 relatively high effort sets, we are going to be moving in the right direction. Again, are we going to be moving super quickly? Is it going to be really noticeable, really quick? Probably not. But that awareness of minimum effective dose and what you can do with that is so powerful. So anytime we're adding something new, be aware of that minimum effective dose. Lean into that. Start there and add from there. So yeah, again, I guess what I would say is you can do worse. If time is not a concern, have at it. If time is a concern, do not let the obvious time constraints of something like that guideline prevent you from doing something. Even a little bit of conditioning work can go a long way.
Yeah, those are great points. And as you mentioned with the sets as well, like good luck doing 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week while rolling like 6+ times a week.
Yeah,
It's just like, there's no way.
right, right.
Blow yourself up.
And that's something that I'm aware of too. Like when I look at those principles or anchors, even if I've got a professional athlete, like sometimes I think as a younger coach, I clung much more tightly to those things. I was like, oh man, I want to like, you go from as a younger coach, you start to work with higher level athletes and you're like, oh my God, they're not restricted by a 9 to 5 anymore. They're not, yeah, you might also be unaware of how much they're running themselves into the ground. Like the gentleman that you said that had that question is already talking about very high training volumes for the sport. So again, yes, we might not have those constraints of the 9 to 5. That person has probably filled that with a lot of really hard training anyways. So yeah, just being aware that like minimum effective dose is a thing. If we're not really too advanced with whatever physical quality we're looking at, and maybe we're not doing a ton of consistent work, sort of like you mentioned as well, like I'm not really looking to optimize with anybody. If they haven't been hitting that quality for at least a consistent year, well, I'm not looking at optimizing a damn thing. I'm looking at how do we hit that minimum effective dose? How do we make it where the next 12 months, every single month, you take a step forward with that variable, however small that step might be. Then after that 12 months, okay, my conditioning's not where I want it to be. I'm still hitting the training volumes on the mats that are necessary for skill development, et cetera, et cetera. Not racking up injuries. I'm not feeling crazy fatigued. What more can we do? All right, cool. Let's check that out. So I think timing is also very important for when we start to really double down on a stimulus and try to maximize. I think nowadays, and I think your platform or my platform can totally be guilty of this sometimes. Like as coaches, we want to talk about those specifics. We want to talk about like what you can do to maximize it. But for that
That's what we
individual,
enjoy.
for sure, dude, I love reading about that
Yeah.
stuff. I love trying that stuff, even myself with my own training. Like sometimes I
Yeah.
fly too close to the sun. I'm like, oh man, I'm psyched about something for a period of time. I'm really crushing it. And then I'm like, okay, that's too much. Cool. Let's dial it back. But I think, I've also got a pretty advanced training age myself. So I kind of know what I can get away with when I do fly too close to the sun because I'm also
Mm.
already doing minimum effective dose and have for a long time. So upping that training volume is less of a big deal for me than someone who has not consistently stuck with it for a while, jumps up to what's optimal or maximal, and then they're just burning a candle at both ends.
Yeah. I think Paul here corrected me. He's talking about on the mat 80/20. So he's got a coach on board at the moment. and even said to him, "You're grappling that much. I want to manage on the mat fatigue." I don't know if
Okay,
Paul needs.
I
You got that?
think, I'm gonna jump in. I think he might be talking about, that breakdown that I did for one of my athletes, Marlon, a month or 2 ago when he won ADCC trials,
Okay,
because
yep, go into it.
yeah, in that I was talking about how Marlon only does 20 to 30% of his total training at competition pace. He's really, really good at being disciplined and going in with an objective of skill building, which I think is huge. I actually love this subject because a lot of people, a lot of us fall in love with something like jujitsu because you get into it and you're able to just get those hard rounds.
100% every day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's the way, man.
Yeah, and it's tough, right? Because
Yeah.
you look at other sports, other combat sports, something like MMA or boxing. Obviously, you can't do full contact, 100% sparring multiple days a week because your brain matter is gonna be coming out of your nose
Yeah.
in a
Or
matter
even
of
any sport. Rugby,
yeah.
we had 1 contact day a week, maybe 2, and then it'll be 2 for game day as well, so you have 2 contact days a week in season, you know?
Right, which already is like that is a load management strategy, obviously for your brain, but it also applies to the rest of your body. Unfortunately, well, fortunately and unfortunately, fortunately for your brain, that's not the case in jujitsu. Unfortunately for the rest of your body, you don't have this hard break for load management, and a lot of times that's how these guys get these mismanaged minor injuries that become far more major than they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think if he's talking about the 20-80 there for like 20% of his mat time is at competition pace and 80% is much more skill building, which is going to be more productive for your coordination, tactics, techniques, that sort of thing. And at the same time, far easier on your body. Love that strategy. Absolutely love it. And you can tinker it from there, right? If you find that you need a little more like 30%, or maybe you need to go lower than 20% because your total mat time is actually quite high, all of those things are valid. Again, some of that flexibility within that framework, but the anchor there is the fact that the majority of your mat time is probably going to be best spent skill building as opposed to having rounds that are happening at, the pace of like the final for worlds, right? So yeah, in general, significant majority of that mat time being skill building, super valuable. For anyone who is a lower, newer to the sport, it can be really tough,
Yeah,
because
it's almost impossible for them.
yeah, yeah, however, I do think exposing people to that idea as soon as possible is really big. And then, yes, of course, they're gonna have limitations. They're gonna be like, "Man, it's really tough for me to do that." But planting the seed for that idea early, I think, is crucial for longevity in sport.
I'm gonna give you 2 scenarios. For someone who's maybe only training 2, 3 times a week, would they still apply this principle? And the second scenario, maybe I don't know if this even happens anywhere, but if someone's training 6 plus times a week, but maybe their classes are heavily live or sparring based, how could they potentially implement this?
Okay, I'm gonna jump on that second scenario
Yep.
first, if that's cool.
Yeah.
So I initially was exposed to the skill building approach to live rounds by Keenan, who was a training partner of mine at Atos in those early years, and he was very vocal about how he'd be working on something. And that would be his goal for that given live session. So he's still going. He's not trying to do something separate from the main class, but he goes in that day and he's like, all right, today I'm working on collar and sleeve. So during all of his live rounds, he's pulling guard, he's going to collar and sleeve. And early on, maybe that means you're getting passed early, but you're identifying at what points you're getting past, you're starting to that can then direct your film study or your questions to other people who maybe are more proficient at that. But yeah, I actually think a lot of that skill building will happen in a more live or open context. And I think that applies whether you're doing something that's more the traditional learning setting, with drilling and things like that, or the CLA approach, which is also gaining a lot of steam. So yeah, I think that that actually applies a ton, and that's where you're actually going to see the most value of it because you're taking something. If you're taking an hour of live training, that is maybe the most condensed stressor that you're encountering. So if you're able to take that hour of live training and tell yourself for that day, maybe that's a night class, the next morning you're hitting your strength work. That night class, you are skill building exclusively. Whatever that thing is that you're workshopping, you're working on just that. It is going to decrease the physiological stress placed on you while also building a lot of the coordination, a lot of the stuff mentally. It's going to be a very good mental training session, with the added benefit of being far less fatiguing. So yeah, I love that. Now, for someone who's only training 2 or 3 days a week, man, again, because I think so much of the sport hinges on your ability to build those skills, the relative percentage split might be different, but even if you're training once a week, if you take that one training session and you go in deliberately and say, hey, I'm going to do everything today to keep getting to this position and get additional reps here and try to workshop this and really see what types of reactions, what types of counters I'm experiencing when I do this, I just refuse to see that as a poorly spent day. Quite frankly, there are plenty of scenarios where if someone's training once a week and they just go in for hard rounds, while that might, the primal like baboon brain side of us might really like that, how much better have we actually gotten there anyways? I mean, quite frankly, that person has very limited mat time as it is, so being able to do that in a very like measured, calculated, uh, very deliberate format is like a superpower. You're maximizing your time. So I think it's huge for fatigue management for people who have a ton of mat time. But I also think it's like an accelerator for somebody who has far less mat time and wants to just get as good as they can within whatever time frame they have. I think it's huge. I think it's extremely beneficial, and to what degree you want to use that is absolutely up to you. Someone wanted to split some of that class where they go, okay, these two guys are around my weight and skill level, so for them I'm going to have my comp focused rounds, and then for everybody else that I go against who is maybe either lighter or heavier or less skilled than me or whatever, you're doing stuff that is much more deliberate and is that skill building type of approach. I mean, that can work too. I do think when you split a session like that, it can be kind of tough to not blur those lines, right? You start to really feel yourself a little bit. You feel that baboon brain coming out, and you want to just keep going. It's a lot easier to say, hey, this whole session is gonna be this. You sort of drop your expectations. You put that ego at an appropriate level. I'm a huge fan of like not hating on the word ego, whether it's for jujitsu or lifting. Like fucking ego lifting's incredible, right? Having an ego while you're training is important. Like, how are we actually going to audit what we're doing? How are we going to be aware of what we should be doing there and improve on that? Like, no ego is just kind of like flat, right? I think this hate on the ego is it's like the pendulum swings a little bit too far. We need that ego. I think it's very healthy. It's what keeps you in there wanting to improve. It's a very important thing, and we want to sort of foster that. We just don't want to let it become completely unchecked to where if you go with somebody who is less skilled than you tell yourself, "Oh, this guy can't pass me." Like, bro, let the guy pass. You know what I mean? If you're working on something, who cares? Something that when I do have some clients that sometimes struggle with that, and so I ask them, with a certain training partner that they can't have eat them. I'm like, okay, with Mark, he can't beat you. Cool. What was your round like with Mark a week and a half ago? Oh, I beat him. Okay, cool. What happened? I don't remember. Yeah, neither does Mark, dude. Like, so drop that element of it. Something that I think is huge is with certain guys. Let's say they're one of those. Oh, I don't pull guard, and this is just a jujitsu guy, right? And sure, maybe that does end up being your competition identity. Maybe you get really good at passing, and you actually have an entire thing off that. But let's say you say that, but you also have a really bad guard. If you took a month and every single class, every single round, you just pulled guard, even if that doesn't end up being your A game, what can that do for your guard development from a technical and tactical standpoint for the 10 years that come after it? Like, it's so, so valuable. So that is like a perfect example. Someone's like, oh, I never pull guard. I'm like, cool, pull guard every single round of every single class for 1 month. No one's going to remember that where they all of a sudden pat fine. You're going to have a retainable skill after that that is going to last. It's going to stay with you far longer than your memory of what happened in those rounds. So that's where I think like keeping that ego in check and not letting it run your entire decision-making process is important.
Very nice. I want to come back to some of the gym stuff as well. How how do you decide what quality maybe you're prioritizing or focusing on for some of your fighters? And this could be maybe in that in-season period that you mentioned where they don't have a lot of competitions, or probably primarily around there versus the in camp.
Yeah. We do the most fatiguing stuff in their quote unquote off season, and we prioritize the less fatiguing stuff, and sometimes some of those more transient qualities like endurance in camp. So generally we're going to push our big strength numbers. If we've got, a lot of people will see me posting stuff on spinal flexion, training those qualities. So I think movement optimists get strawmanned a lot, right? It's not that there's no risk to this. It's not that you can just approach it however you want. Like, I won't lie, a ton of like my Jefferson curls, Zercher deadlifts, things like that, I'm doing when those guys don't have fights scheduled. If I want somebody to progress their Jefferson curl, not just in weight, but also in total range of motion, get into those deeper ranges for spinal flexion, shit, they're getting stacked in class and stuff like that too. So really just hammering the spine, like there's a finite amount of stress that any joint or region of the body can handle at any one point in time. So a lot of those things that can be quite fatiguing, I will do in that off season. So whether that's force production or range of motion, those are the two that I think, especially with jujitsu athletes, will tend to induce the greatest amount of fatigue that can compound with heavy training volumes and present issues. So those two very heavily in the off season, quote unquote off season, and then endurance and power are going to be ones that I do a lot more in season. Tend to be able to do them in a far less fatiguing uh, context. If you look at something like power, if we let's just look at, let's say, a productive session for push press versus military press, right? Force production versus something more impulse or rate of force production. That push press, we've got to hit higher velocities. So in general, you're not going to get anywhere near momentary concentric failure, which is very fatiguing, right? So something like a push press, I may opt to do, even though we're going to obviously get some, it's impossible to just target one of those things. You're going to get some of those tertiary benefits, but something in season, I may opt for a little bit more of a push press, and something in the off season, I may opt for a bit more of a military press. Very simplistic answer, but decisions like that are going to guide my programming in versus off season. Also, total number of working sets. I tend with combat athletes to pretty much never go over 4 sets in the absence of anything like a density set or
Yeah,
anything like that, right? If we're doing
yeah, I'm
straight
pretty much the
sets,
same as you.
yeah, and even 4 sets is kind of
It is
rare.
high. That's like the highest.
Yeah, and that'll generally, if I'm doing 4 sets, it's probably going to be like top set with back offs type deal, right?
Mm,
But yeah, that stuff, more off-season work. In season, there's plenty of scenarios where I'm dropping down to 2. I think 2 is great. It's enough for us to get a very productive stimulus. And even if you go really hard on 2 sets of an exercise, it's going to be tough to be like crazy fatigued from that.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I would say as a general sense, that's about how I structure that. And then the other thing that I do is I'm a big fan of concurrent training. I love getting people. it's funny. You got a lot of people talking about concurrent training, whether that's like hybrid athlete style training, whether that's, more GPP stuff like Angus Bradley, things like that. And then you've got like the classic periodization schemes, right? And these can be quite far from one another uh, on this spectrum. What I will say about like a classical periodization scheme, something that I don't know if it's talked about enough or if I'm just not hearing it talked of enough. I do think there's an incredible amount of value in the buy-in, right? We're doing this phase for this purpose. You get your client or your athlete psyched about that thing. I do take a very concurrent approach year round. However, I shift up our focus a bit. And even though we're still hitting that minimum effective dose for those other variables, I want to get them psyched and bought in about the one thing that we're doing, right? If we're doing something in camp and I'm up in, like, right now, I've got a ton of my gi athletes. A bunch of my guys are competing right now at Pans. Right now, we're doing a ton of conditioning and cardio work, right? And I'm even giving some of them where I know it's their rate limiter, I'm giving them a little bit more to do. Some of those guys will run like privates on my mat. I don't charge them a mat fee, but I'll be like, all right, you're hitting some cardio after that private. And it'll just be a short interval, something that's not crazy fatiguing, but we're sort of like micro dosing a little bit of that stuff. And for the individuals that I know need that, getting a little, an additional exposure of that throughout the week is super valuable. And them knowing like, hey, this block, I'm trying to turn you guys into cardio machines. Now, it's not just a cardio program, but our exposures, our total stressors, and how far we're pushing that variable is certainly turned up. So I think you can take some of the psychological benefits of getting someone bought in on like, hey, this is the goal that we're going for right now. I think that's super underrated. If you just go straight concurrent year round and you're like, yeah, we're kind of doing minimum effective dose or a little more of everything, like buy-in is such a superpower. Like if I can, and I even view it like this, like when I write somebody a program, we've got like the initial sale of them deciding to work with me, right? Cool. We've also got like, and I don't think enough coaches, especially the way that things are talked about today. And I've tried to create content on this. I don't think it's like a sexy topic, but holy shit, dude. I think that if you can get someone psyched about something, when someone comes in, if they're just doing something because they're told to, versus the approach that they take when they're bought in on that thing, there is an ocean of difference between those two examples. And I think there's lots of ways we can do that. Even the way that, I'm doing mostly concurrent training, but I'll communicate it in a way that seems a bit more specialized. It's funny. I even saw there was a discussion on strength and conditioning for jiu-jitsu on Reddit a couple months ago that I saw. And someone was actually like shitting on my programming, saying like, oh, you don't specialized stuff for jiu-jitsu. You just need to train these general qualities. And I didn't even chime in because I'm like, bro, that's what I do. But that's them hearing. It is, but like everyone's got an opinion. I didn't take it personally, but I think what that was them hearing the way that I try to get people amped about whatever month of programming that we're on. And like, if it's a conditioning month, I've still got your strength work in there. Like, I'm not going to let those variables fall to it, right? But I do want to get people really amped up and bought in on like, okay, this month, I got my horse blinders on. Yeah, I'm doing my strength work, but I'm focused on my conditioning right now. And I think the buy-in with that objective, them being aware, like also simplify that shit. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh, this month we're focusing far more on our aerobic base so that next month we're going to be doing far more glycolytic stuff and the aerobic base is going to allow for a greater work rate during, like, fuck all of that. Like, we're doing a conditioning month this month and then we're going to do a more advanced conditioning month next month. Tell them the bare minimum they need to. Hey, you're focused on this detail and let's run with it. Let's see how far we can take that. I think that that's something that's not talked about or stressed enough. I think that if somebody's listening and they've got their own program, as opposed to focusing on what's like optimal, ideal, like if you like an exercise or a modality or a specific set of intervals, like it could be any of these little individual tools. If you like it, find a way to structure your training around that shit and don't just do the stuff you like, but involve as much of it as you can into a well-rounded plan. Because if you're psyched to do the thing, you're going to execute at a higher level. And you and I could go, back and forth about how we might train for this variable differently than this one. I could structure the most beautifully designed program with whether it's RPEs or percentages or whatever. But if the person goes through it half-assed, it is going
Mhm.
to yield lackluster results. So I think the communication of those things, and again, the way that we can do that is nearly infinite. But if you can communicate it in a way that gets even a little buy-in, you sell them on an exercise. Shit, dude, like Zerchers, some people love them, some hate them. If I've got Zerchers on there and someone doesn't like it, let's say I'm training a team and they don't like it, I don't think twice. It's not a part of my identity.
Yeah.
It's like a hammer to a carpenter, right? He's like, man, I just fucking hate Zerchers. Cool. What squat do you like instead? Dude, I love front squats. Awesome. You're front squatting. That's it. That's the
Yeah.
end. Like that person's now going to be more bought in. They're going to attack that front squat in a way that is way different. If they're distracted by the discomfort of the bar on their forearms, cool. Let's get it out of there. Do the thing that you like a little bit more, and let's focus on how you execute that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to set an environment that one has the multivariable stimulus that's necessary for success, but that's just our foundation. Where we go from there is how the person executes, and I can't do it for them. So I got to sell them on it. I got to make them like really believe in this process. If they don't understand why they're doing something, I've got to fill in those blanks for them. It's not a matter of me being a dictator and just being like, oh, just do it because I said so. Like, let's
Yeah.
talk, and I really think that's like a dying element in today's day and age where everything is just getting so hyper optimized and everything else. Like, get someone psyched to train, have those guiding principles and everything else. You've got an ocean of gray area between those things. Wherever you end up in that ocean is not important as long as you're following those principles and the person who's doing it is in some way excited or at least enthusiastic to do it. So yeah, I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, but
No,
I
good.
think that's important.
It's funny you mentioned about being married to exercises. I saw an Instagram profile the other day. I think it was, I don't know, I can't remember what it was called, but it was like the lunge guy. And it was just everything about lunges. And I was like, bro, like, how can you brand yourself an exercise like the lunge? Where do you go from there? Like, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, would there be again, like if we look at a technician in another context, is there a carpenter that's like the saw guy? Like, would he really be the best craftsman? Like, hell no,
Maybe?
right? Uh, so yeah, I mean, like for example, anyone who is familiar with my stuff, or if they, if through this um podcast they go and browse through my page, they might think I'm like the Zercher guy. Um, for my own training, that is an exercise that gets me psyched to train. Love them, right? I also think on some level, from a coaching perspective, they're so easy to coach. For like a front
Mm.
loaded squat variation, there's just so much wiggle room where someone can figure it out. I think the elbows, that discomfort provides like dummy proof load management. I love it. But what I would say, like if you look at all my programs, it's not my most frequently programmed like squat variation. It's a high bar back squat. And out of all the squat variations, that's the one that I do the least. I'm really just trying to identify tools for the job, and I'm plugging and playing
Yeah.
things in as they make sense. But my page is also a bit of a reflection of me. Sue me, but I like that variation for myself. So if you're seeing a video of me squatting, I'm probably either doing front squats or Zercher squats. I just like them, and that allows me to get the best results. So I just try to emulate that with my clients, right? I'm not trying to have them be shitty versions of me. I'm trying to find that stuff that really makes them tick and leaning into that to get to that desired result.
Nice. Yeah, don't sue me though, because I'm already being sued. So with the well, you mentioned obviously with that strength to power phase, how like that military press to push press example. Do you ever play around with range of motion? And that say you're going from like full squat to quarter squat. Is that anything that you kind of like to do?
Yeah, we do stuff with like block pulls, things like floor
Yeah.
press, board press. Yeah, I love playing with all those details. I think, yeah, like even with squats, I do a lot of like pin or Anderson squats. I love to have people like this month with my
Those
online
are my
program.
favorite.
Yeah, bro. Oh, it's great. And like, man, you do like a Zercher Anderson squat, like a Zercher pin squat, and you just tell someone, yeah, we're starting a little bit above parallel, just horse heft and heave, just massive loads, right? Get that going. So like right now, I love it. This month of my online programming it's a conditioning focused month. And one of the primary strength things one day is an EMOM of hitting doubles with that Zercher pin squat. And
Oh,
like
nice.
I'm like, guys, go heavy with that, you know? And we're getting some good stuff there, right? Like total density within that is beautiful. In a 10 or 12 minute EMOM, you're getting, 20 to 24 reps in there. It's going to be
Mhm.
at a pretty damn heavy load. And because we're limiting range of motion there, you're not going to accumulate as much fatigue as you might expect given the weight on the bar and everything else. I love playing with those variables, and I don't think it's one thing or the other. I did this a while ago, and it landed the way I wanted it to. It was essentially I showed one of my clients doing a really deep squat, and I was like, on average, uh, range of motion is a very important detail for jiu-jitsu athletes. So in the second half of the video was, so then why would we ever do this? And it was another one of my jiu-jitsu athletes doing a box squat. And of course you got a bunch of, they're like, I would never do a box squat with a jiu-jitsu athlete. And I'm like, that's such a shame, dude. Such a shame. I mean, you look at some of those other benefits there, right? We're removing the stretch reflex and forcing somebody to really generate force from that static position. Super valuable, right? Also, if you're doing something that is a bit more of a squat focused program, your secondary squat as a box squat is going to be a bit less fatiguing, allow for greater exposures to something with some crossover that's just not as fatiguing. So your primary squat day, you can go nice and heavy. There's just so many reasons that you can still do that. So yeah, I think there's a time and a place for all that stuff. There's a time and a place to squat super deep. There's a time and a place to elevate your heels and get deeper than you would normally, especially if your rate limiter is maybe that ankle mobility. And then there's also a time and a place to hit like a freaking Zercher Anderson squat and just load up more weight on the bar than you've ever had there before. It's great.
Yeah, that easily one of the most fun exercises is just benching off pins. Oh, my favorite, bench off the pins with a fat bar at chest
Hell
level.
yeah. Hell
That's
yeah.
like five, four, three, two, one. The GOAT set rep scheme for pin work. It's just like hit that on everything. that
Yes,
that's
it
always
is.
the funnest. Yeah, man. Before we finish up, we're almost there. Well, I think it'll be quite interesting to run through just a general strength training template that someone could use. Maybe kind of like a template that you generally use, maybe for, I don't know, obviously there's different phases and whatnot, but just a general idea of how someone could put it together.
Cool. I'm working on a post on this right now. All right.
Oh, perfect.
And I'm going to sort of structure it the way that I have outlined in my notebook here. So,
Sweet.
all right, I'm gonna start coming from, you're not doing any strength training. So how do we just get to a passing grade for covering your bases and doing something? I love for a full body day, if we're taking a bit of a minimalist approach here, lower, upper, upper, lower for your four motions, and then we're going to break them up to diversify that a bit. Let's go knee dominant, upper body pull, upper body push, hip dominant, right? So that could look like something along the lines of, you got a squat, you got let's say a vertical press, so like that military press or that push press. If maybe you want a little bit of power in there, that's cool. Uh, Horizontal pull, a cable row, keep it nice and simple, and then a hip dominant. You could either go with some general hinge. If you want to really like diversify things between the two lowers, if this one's bilateral, make this one unilateral. So let's take a single leg RDL. That is a great full body session. If you want a passing grade, if you want to go from nothing to something, do 2 or 3 sets of each of those exercises. You cover the vast majority of your muscle groups, getting some great stuff in there. Passing grade. Is that an A? Hell no, but it's a passing grade. Okay, we want to go up from there. Let's actually add a couple plyos before that first lower body lift. I think plyos are great to get you to a state of like optimal readiness. They're also just a great thing to train in and of themselves, and their effect on rates of lower body injuries in sport are phenomenal. So great return on investment there. Pick 2 plyos. We could get super advanced on that, or we can even add in like some med ball work. If you want to maybe get some rotation, great. Then at the end of that session, I will pick either accessory work, 1 to 2 accessory exercises, or a conditioning circuit, right? So plyos, 3 to 4 of those strength movements. Sometimes I'll take off the second lower body, because I'm getting some additional stuff from plyos, maybe. So let's go 2 plyos, squat, push, pull, and then either 2 accessory exercises. Could be some arm work if you want to do that. Could be some neck stuff. Could be grip work. Could be you can hit like some calves. I love to pair up calves and hamstrings. I love doing here we've got like a great setup for calf raises right into some Nordics, right? That can be whatever you feel you need to do. Sometimes that accessory work will be more core, quote unquote, oriented, whether that we're focusing on rotation, flexion. Maybe it's like some Jefferson curl stuff that's not super heavy. It's not in a strength context, right? We're just really pausing at the bottom, focusing on that range of motion. So you could do 2 accessory exercises, or 10-ish minutes worth of higher intensity, usually glycolytic if we're doing it at the end of a session, conditioning work. If you do any combination of that, 2 plyos, 3 to 4 strength movements, either 2 accessories or conditioning, man, you're checking so many boxes. We're hitting minimum effective dose on almost every, if not every, general variable in that session. That is an A. And then, of course, based on how many days per week, another thing that I'm really big on, and this is another thing that I don't think is talked about enough, for my athletes, I push like pretty damn high frequencies for their strength and conditioning with way lower volumes. Yes, it's true that you only need to do 2 days per week, but like even that template I gave you, if I slash out a ton of those exercises and sort of morph that 1 day into 2 days, and instead of having somebody in here 2 days a week, I have them in here 4 days a week with shorter sessions, less fatiguing, less overlap. Just get them in 45 minutes, get them out, and do that 4 days a week. Way, way better on average. We've also got more contact points where potentially they come in with lower fatigue levels, and we can really crank on some of this stuff. That's good. By having more points throughout the week, you've got a greater probability of those landing on a good day. That's awesome. Because if you only got 2 and then they come in and one of those days they're flat as hell, we're going to have a rough session. You got a lot of volume in there. So another thing that I like to do is that, given that format that I gave you, take half of that shit, throw it to another day, and double the number of days you can get in there. Obviously, if you work a 9 to 5 or something like that, that can be tough. I have the benefit of literally like just living in a gym, so that's easy for me. I personally train strength. My strength and conditioning is like 6 days a week, but I'm doing 2 to 3 exercises per session. That's it. High intensities, move on. So yeah, a lot of wiggle room there, but that general format allows you to have a pretty solid full body session, to hit multiple variables, all of which will transfer to your sport. Yeah, and that's the template that I use with the hundreds of jiu-jitsu athletes that I train.
Perfect. That's a perfect way to end this podcast, Alex. Where can people find you? Keep up with what you're doing.
Cool. On Instagram, you've got my personal page, which is alex.sterner, and Electrum Performance, which is the name of my gym and business. And then on YouTube, also Electrum Performance.
Perfect. I'll link all this up in the description too for anyone who wants to check it out. But I appreciate you coming on, Alex.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. It was a blast.